the machines that should not have been on a battlefield. Oberleutnant Franz Ritter stared through his binoculars, rain spattering the lenses, wind tearing through the hedgerows. Engines coughed in the distance. Birds took frantic flight. Somewhere a farm dog barked. But Ritter wasn't watching the countryside. He wasn't counting Allied infantry training exercises. He wasn't tracking the tanks rolling over the muddy roads. He was staring at something impossible. A line of shapes, square and lumbering, moving across the fields. Entire battalions, or so they appeared. And yet, they weren't tanks. Wooden turrets clattered. Canvas flapped. Smoke puffed from makeshift chimneys. The armored division was made of farm tractors, painted and disguised, pretending to be the spearhead of an invasion. Ritter's eyes widened. Das ist unmöglich. This is impossible. The fog rolled across the English fields like a wet, suffocating blanket. Wind tore through the hedgerows, bending branches and rattling roofs. Somewhere, a distant church bell tolled, hollow and slow, swallowed immediately by the gray dawn. On a ridge overlooking the patchwork of farms, Oberleutnant Franz Ritter raised his binoculars. His stomach clenched. His fingers shook. He had seen Allied armor before. He knew the silhouettes of every Sherman, Cromwell, and Stuart. He could identify the spacing of tracks, the shape of turrets, even the glint of steel in the sun. But what he was seeing now made no sense. A column of tanks moved through the fields below. At least 30, maybe 40. Dark, square shapes lumbering over the wet soil, their turrets jerking unnaturally with each rut. Smoke puffed from their engines, curls of gray twisting into the morning mist. Ritter's lips parted. His heartbeat thundered in his ears. Something was wrong. The tanks wobbled. They jolted like drunken men. Canvas flapped where steel should have been. A turret spun on a sudden bump, revealing, just for a heartbeat, the faint glint of wood beneath the paint. He lowered his binoculars, blinked, wiped rain from the lenses, adjusted, heart hammering, and then it hit him. These were not tanks, not real tanks, not anything that should have existed on a battlefield. They were tractors, farm tractors, painted, armored with canvas, fitted with wooden turrets. Smoke generators puffed clouds meant to mimic engine exhaust. Men scurried behind them, adjusting tarps, hammering boards, coaxing engines to roar convincingly. From a distance, the illusion was perfect. From above, it could fool anyone. Ritter's mind swirled. Entire divisions where none existed. Armored brigades marching across the countryside, yet built from the simplest machines on earth. The audacity, the genius, the absurdity struck him silent. And yet, there was something almost beautiful in the sight. The clumsy, lumbering tractors, pretending to be the steel giants of Allied power, rolling forward with relentless determination, carrying with them the fate of a continent. Ritter swallowed hard. Cold mud soaked through his boots. Rain spattered his face. The wind whipped his coat like a flag of warning. And he whispered, almost to himself, Das ist unmöglich. This is impossible. Because in that moment he realized, the Allies were not just preparing to fight. They were preparing to deceive. And the first wave of that deception was rolling across the fields, disguised as an army, powered by nothing more than tractors and human ingenuity. The morning fog over southern England carried more than moisture. Carried secrets. Smoke from chimneys mingled with the scent of wet earth. The fields were quiet, almost peaceful. But that peace was an illusion. Across war rooms and map tables, Allied generals stared at aerial photographs and intelligence reports with growing unease. Every coastal town, every cliff, every hedgerow in northern France had been transformed into a fortress. Hitler's Atlantic Wall stretched for thousands of miles. Steel, concrete, mines, barbed wire, anti-tank obstacles, pillboxes bristling with artillery. Every inch of sand, every curve of a river, every bend in the road had been weaponized. And yet, the Allies faced a deeper problem than walls, guns, or mines. German expectations. Hitler did not expect Normandy. He did not believe the Allies would strike where the coastline was narrow, fortified, and deadly. He was convinced the main attack would come at Pas-de-Calais, the shortest crossing from England. Every reconnaissance report, every decoy plan, every fake signal sent reinforced that belief. The Allies had no choice. They had to sell the illusion. They had to convince the Germans that the attack would strike somewhere else entirely. Entire divisions, armored corps, mechanized brigades, everything had to appear where it did not exist. But the problem was immediate, complex, and terrifying. How do you make dozens of tanks appear where none exist? How do you convince trained officers in bunkers, observing through binoculars and cameras, that every regiment is real? How do you hide the real invasion force while the Germans watch every movement? The solution came from a combination of audacity and absurdity. A plan so simple it was genius. They would build fake armies. Entire armored divisions made of wood, canvas, and clever engineering. Tanks that could be seen from the air but not approached. Radio chatter to fill the airwaves. Tire tracks carved into mud like ghost divisions moving information. At night, engineers tested the mock-ups, dragging wooden turrets through fields, creating shadows that looked real in moonlight. Signals officers transmitted phony orders. Observers from high points were fooled over and over again. The Allies called it Operation Fortitude, and its heart was deception. Convince the Germans that Patton's armored divisions waited at Pas-de-Calais, poised to strike. Keep the real assault hidden at Normandy. Every tractor, every canvas tank, every smoke puff, every fake radio transmission had to be perfect. Failure wasn't an option. If the Germans ever discovered the truth, the real invasion force would land on Normandy's beaches and face the full might of concentrated German armor. Thousands of lives would be lost before a single Allied soldier could step forward. And so, the simplest of machines, the farm tractor, was about to become the linchpin of the greatest deception in military history. The work began in barns, workshops, and fields across southern England. The smell of wet wood mingled with engine oil and the tang of wet iron. Men in coveralls hammered, sawed, and welded by lantern light, their faces streaked with sweat and grime. Outside, the wind rattled loose tiles, and rain hammered the roof as if questioning the sanity of the enterprise. It was absurd. It was brilliant. The engineers called them Q-tanks. Wooden turrets bolted to farm tractors, canvas stretched over improvised armor, and steel plates scavenged from warehouses. Smoke generators were rigged to engines, spewing clouds to mimic diesel exhaust. Wheels were fitted with mudguards and painted patterns to resemble treads from a distance. Every detail had to fool reconnaissance planes, officers with binoculars, and photographers who would later report to Hitler's headquarters. One tractor might be a Sherman, another a Churchill, all fake, all convincing. Corporal James "Jimmy" Halloway, a carpenter-turned-deception artist, worked on a turret for a tractor the size of a donkey. Hammering a nail into a wooden frame, he muttered, "If this works, they'll think Patton himself is coming to breakfast." Nearby, a Royal Signals officer tested a phonograph for fake radio chatter. Static crackled. Voices barked orders. Artillery positions were reported destroyed. Troop movements transmitted, not by real soldiers, but by the men in the shadows, puppeteering the illusion. The first tests were disasters. Tractors broke down. Wooden turrets collapsed. Canvas flapped uselessly in the wind, revealing the absurd truth beneath. One night, during a dress rehearsal in a muddy field, a Q-tank tipped over in a ditch, sending engineers splashing into the water. Laughter echoed through the fog, because if you didn't laugh, you'd cry. And yet, slowly, painstakingly, they perfected the design. Turrets were reinforced with scrap metal. Canvas armor was coated to appear like steel in the morning light. Smoke generators were tuned to match the hiss and puff of real tank engines. Wooden hulls were painted with patterns that mimicked shadows and rivets. By 1944, dozens of Q-tanks could roll across a field in formation, leaving tracks that looked like armored battalions had passed. From the air, the deception was flawless. From a distance, even a trained officer could swear the Allies had brought an entire armored corps to the countryside. And yet, they were tractors. Simple, stubborn, unassuming farm machines that had once plowed fields and hauled hay. Now they were soldiers in disguise, part of a plan so audacious it could only work if every man, every nail, every puff of smoke was perfect. Engineer Halloway looked at the row of Q tanks, muddy and wobbling, and whispered to himself, "God help the Germans. They'll never know what hit them." Because he was right. The tractors were about to become more than machines. They would become icons of deception, a literal army of illusions marching into history. They were not soldiers in the usual sense. They carried no rifles, no grenades, no bayonets. Yet, in many ways, they were more dangerous than infantry. These were the men of the Q workshops, the engineers, carpenters, and illusionists who turned ordinary tractors into the most convincing tanks in history. And alongside them, the American deception units, radio magicians, and map manipulators who made smoke and would speak like armored divisions. Their weapons were tools: hammers, saws, drills, canvas, paint, scrap metal, wires and phonographs that carried fake orders across empty fields. They worked in silence or in whispered laughter, often under the threat of rain, wind, and mud that seemed determined to undo every effort. Lanterns flickered over sawdust-strewn floors. Wooden boards groaned as they were bent and shaped. Smoke from engines mixed with the smell of wet earth. Every detail mattered. Every imperfection could give the secret away. Lieutenant Henry Hank Calloway, an American engineer with a knack for radio deception, spent nights teaching his men to broadcast fake messages as if a division were marching across the countryside. "Make it convincing," he told them. "Make them believe it's alive. The enemy must think we are everywhere." Nearby, carpenters hammered turrets to tractors. Sheet metal groaned as it was bent into impossible shapes. Canvas flapped violently in the wind, and the men cursed, wiped mud from their eyes, and tried again. Each failure was a lesson. Each success was a small triumph against an enemy they might never see. They were invisible, yet their work would decide the fate of thousands. Without them, the soldiers who would land on Normandy's beaches would face the full force of the Atlantic Wall. With them, those same soldiers might find the path cleared, or at least the enemy misled. They were engineers, artists, and pranksters all rolled into one. They were heroes whose names would never appear in dispatches, whose faces would never appear on posters. Yet every wooden turret, every puff of fake smoke, every forged radio transmission carried their courage. And in the quiet of the night, when the tractors sat like soldiers at attention in muddy fields, they understood something profound. They were creating an army from nothing. Not with bullets, not with tanks, not with men in uniform, but with deception, ingenuity, and sheer audacity. Somewhere, far across the channel, German officers would soon look at fields and see an armored division. But it would be an army of ghosts, an army made of wood, canvas, and smoke. And it was these men, the soldiers behind the ruse, who had made it all possible. Night fell across southern England like a heavy curtain, blanketing fields, villages, and forests in near-total darkness. Mist curled over the ground, clinging to the grass, swallowing the distant lights of farmhouses. Somewhere, the bark of a dog echoed. Somewhere else, a tractor engine coughed, then roared, as if announcing its presence to a world that was not meant to see it. This was the moment when the deception came alive. Across dozens of fields, Q-tanks moved in formation, guided by men with lanterns and flashlights, moving as quietly as possible, leaving tire tracks that mimicked the tread of armored divisions. Engineers adjusted wooden turrets as if the machines themselves were breathing. Smoke generators hissed and puffed, creating the illusion of life. Every movement, every shadow, every sound was orchestrated with meticulous care. Radio operators sat intense, phonographs whirring, crackling fake commands across the airwaves. Artillery coordinates, division movements, even fictional supply convoys, they all existed only in this invisible world. But to anyone listening, it was real, a full corps in motion. The field commanders, engineers, and deception specialists worked like clockwork. A tractor would wobble. Turret would collapse. Men would curse, reset, and start again. Failure was unacceptable. The Germans had to believe it. Entire divisions, poised for invasion, had to appear where none existed. Lieutenant Calloway, crouched in the mud beside a tractor, whispered through his radio. Formation Delta. Move forward. Keep the smoke low. Don't let them see the engines are fake. It was absurd. It was brilliant. At dawn, German reconnaissance aircraft would sweep these fields, cameras clicking, recording every inch. And what they would see were armored divisions, tanks, brigades, mechanized infantry moving into position. All the while, the real Allied armies slept, prepared to strike somewhere else entirely. The Q-tanks were not just vehicles. They were illusion made real. Each wooden turret, each canvas hull, every puff of smoke, every fake tire track carried a message. The Allies were strong, everywhere, ready to strike. And for the men behind the deception, each night of toil was another gamble with history. One mistake, one exposed tractor, and the Germans would know the truth. Normandy would become a bloodbath. But the illusion held. By the time dawn broke, entire fields looked like armored divisions were massing. And somewhere across the channel, German officers reported the impossible. Battalions where none existed, ready to strike at Pas-de-Calais. Operation Fortitude was no longer a plan. It was alive. It was massive. It was brilliant. And it was about to fool Hitler himself. Dawn over northern France was gray and cold, the mist clinging to the coastline like a shroud. Somewhere high above the English countryside, Luftwaffe reconnaissance planes skimmed the clouds, cameras clicking, engines whining, taking photos of what they believed were the spearhead of the Allied armored corps. Below, in the fields of southern England, the Q-tanks waited. Wooden turrets wobbled, canvas flapped, smoke curled from chimneys, and tire tracks cut the mud in perfect parallel lines. From the air, it was flawless. From above, Patton's phantom divisions marched as if alive. The German pilots took photos, noted positions, radioed reports back to headquarters. Every observation confirmed the impossible. Allied divisions massing at Pas-de-Calais, poised to strike, armored strength overwhelming and imminent. They had no idea that tanks were tractors. Not a single real Sherman had moved. Back in the German command bunkers, officers scrutinized the reports. Maps were annotated, orders were drawn, units repositioned. Troops and artillery were concentrated away from Normandy, waiting for the phantom armies that would never arrive. And then came June 6th. The real invasion force hit Normandy. Landing craft churned the surf. Men fell into the waves. Tanks struggled through sand and obstacles. Machine guns raked the beach. Chaos reigned. Yet, thousands of lives were saved. Not because of superior firepower, not because of more tanks or artillery, but because the Germans had moved their forces elsewhere, fooled by wooden turrets, canvas, and smoke. Across Normandy, German commanders were paralyzed. Armored divisions waited near Calais, waiting for Patton's invisible force to appear. Reinforcements could not reach the beaches. Every delay, every hesitation, gave the Allies precious minutes to secure the landings, to push inland, to survive the deadly first hours. Somewhere in a German bunker, Oberleutnant Franz Ritter reviewed the photos again. Disbelief etched across his face. He traced the shapes with a trembling finger. Tanks? No, not tanks. Not real. Tractors. Simple farm machines. And yet, those tractors had made the beaches survivable. They had created illusions that reshaped the course of history. The Q-tanks, absurd and fragile, had become silent heroes. No medals, no parades, no glory. Yet they had won something more important. Time, safety, and victory. Across England, the men of the Q workshops and American deception units smiled quietly. Their machines had rolled across fields, left tire tracks, puffed smoke, fooled the enemy, and survived the scrutiny of war. They had made entire divisions exist where none did. They had brought ingenuity to bear against the might of an empire. And in the aftermath, when historians pieced together the Normandy invasion, they realized something astonishing. The battle had been won long before the first man stepped onto the beach. It had been won in barns and fields, by men and tractors, by wooden turrets and canvas armor, by illusion made real. The German officer who first saw them lowered his binoculars for the last time. His eyes, wide with disbelief, traced the fields. He whispered, almost inaudibly, all of this built by tractors. And in that moment he understood the truth. The Allies had not only invaded France, they had reshaped reality itself. And the simplest machines on Earth, the tractors, unassuming and absurd, had done what no weapon, no strategy, no artillery could. They had killed tanks without firing a shot, and won the war in the mind of the enemy. The tractor that should never have been a weapon had become one of the most brilliant instruments of deception in history. And it all began quietly, in the muddy fields of England, with men, wood, and smoke.